Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. I'm so glad you're back. And it's me, Heather, and also Mike Huber is here.
Hello.
And I'm still nervous about just recording one-on-one with people because I still have a little bit of the chemo brain fog going. But Mike assures me he can talk if I forget how to talk.
I can talk, and you know, sometimes it can get a little unfiltered. So
we'll just go
see.
with that. So Mike and I are going to talk about evidence-based and research-based claims and just sort of research in general. And this is coming from a couple of weeks ago. I shared, and I've seen this all over Facebook in the last few weeks, an article by Peter Gray called "Beware of Evidence-Based Preschool Curricula." And you can find it easily by either following Peter Gray on Facebook or Googling "Beware of Evidence-Based Preschool Curricula," and it should pop right up for folks. But when I posted it, when I shared that on Facebook, Mike, you said, and this is our quote for today, Mike's Facebook comment, when someone says evidence-based, the questions are as follows. What evidence were you looking for? Why were you looking for it? And who is it for? So I'm going to start by letting you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, admittedly, I was taking Lisa Murphy's 3 questions that we use for our classroom, but also it strikes me that a lot of times, especially when it's in legislation, like No Child Left Behind and things, it's these large companies that create assessment tools that push for that, you know? Mm-hmm. So then they have a reason to sell assessment tools to everybody because they can do that. So that's who it's for. Is it for the kids? I don't think so. I mean, I don't see any evidence of evidence-based working. And in fact, I guess I wrote an article this year about the pandemic and that this was the perfect test case, that if we got rid of all the stuff we don't measure for and just have kids online learning, you know, the things we do measure, they should do way better, and we should have these kids who are just brilliant from the pandemic. It turns out the things we don't measure with evidence-based are the things that matter to kids, and so it's not for kids. So that was the main thing. But then the question is, when you say evidence-based, what does that mean? So
yeah, and it's something that I've sort of I guess had my own growth trajectory with, where I used to just be really impressed by research. And if anyone said this was research-based, and I use the phrase a lot, and I still love to read it. Like I love to read journal articles, and but it just seems like it's an attempt to get adults on board. And specifically in the early childhood context, we have to talk about research because that's the only way we can be taken seriously. But then what can be measured by research? There's a lot of intangibles, as you mentioned, in early childhood care and in education that can't be measured. So that's already one strike against it. But also, we're not looking then at let's research things specifically about kids. We're looking at, let's research the things that would sell this to adults. Let's do research about whether this curriculum, gets them a better test score on their kindergarten screening test or whatever.
Right.
And so it's research-based, but one of my big problems with the phrase is, should that thing that we researched and that you now claim to have proof of, its efficacy or whatever, even be a goal? Should that even be a goal we have for young children? And that's where I get really sort of uptight about it.
I had a preschooler, this would have been 25 years ago now, but it's when I taught in New York City, in Brooklyn, and this kid could name the entire infield and outfield of the New York Yankees, something which I have never been able to do, but that was his thing. And thinking about it, what you were just saying, what if we made that the goal? We want all preschoolers to name that. They can't, we probably could. We could do that, and we could measure it.
Right. And we could develop a curriculum that led to that.
And we could develop a curriculum that leads to it. And I mean, it's a silly example, but you could do it with just about anything that a lot of the things that, some of these, they're usually aimed more at parents than teachers, but around like learning the names of famous artists and famous paintings or whatever it is, different things tends to be things that maybe white middle class culture aspires to, like, oh yeah, like people who really make it, they know whatever fine art or whatever it is. And kids can learn that, and kids can develop that. And again, it's like, but what's the point of that? I mean, if a child's into it, of course, like, just like that child who's into the Yankees, I had nothing against him. Probably his first, words that he spelled were, I think it was Derek Jeter at the time was the most famous Yankee.
Yeah.
It's probably the only one I could name. But, that's probably how he learned to spell,
Yeah.
So, which is great, that, I mean, more power to him. But the idea that all kids would learn to spell that is just ludicrous. And the same thing is true of any of our concepts. I had a friend who would always ask, why do we teach kids the names of colors, and why do we feel so, like, what does that do for a child? And he was just like, he's like, I've been looking for research to show why kids should learn the names of colors, and I haven't found it yet. And he said, the only thing I've found so far is that it's vocabulary. So we could teach kids like 8 or 9 vocabulary words. That's great. I could teach them 9 vocabulary words of anything.
Yeah. But if you tune into their interests, like the Yankees, you can teach them so many more. I mean, they can learn so many more vocabulary words because that's driven by them.
Right.
But that's not going to be impressive to funders and grantors.
Right. I was telling you that I found an article, and the article is very dense and academic, but the title, I think, gets exactly what you're saying. It's called The Paradox of Evidence-Based Education, From the Decline of Education to, here's the part I think you like, Abandonment of the Theories of Education.
Oh.
So, and the article is by Rohei Matsushita. And I was reading the translated version because I do not read Japanese. And I apologize for the pronunciation. But, the whole point is all of that. I mean, Piaget did do research also. Kind of. Some of the stuff that he, fair enough. And, but, and a lot of it was thought experiments. I mean, Vygotsky too, like he observed a bit, but then he thought about it. But I think the more important thing is, what does it do with children? Like, so what do we do with kids? How does it affect the kids? Who is it for? If it's for the kids, like, oh, when you follow their interests, what do you know? And then Vygotsky and Piaget and others, you could name more than me, I'm sure. I mean, even just the idea of schema theory, right? Like,
it's hard to find good recent research on schema theory.
But no child, like, schema is trying to explain what we see kids do, not what we do to kids or for them.
Two is better.
And I think it helps appreciate, I guess, any research or whatever. Does it help me appreciate the kids or even love the kids? That's the question.
So I think and how do I want to say this? There's a distinction to be made, because I think the teacher as researcher can be very powerful and very effective. And it's usually very child centered, or at least your current group centered, where you have something that you've noticed in the moment and you want to think more about it, learn more about it, maybe solve a problem, which I think is where schema comes in really nicely. And that's much different than, academic research that we put up on the pedestal and we aren't allowed to question because it's research. But the thing about that, and I haven't done academic research. I've been in, when I was in the speech language department at Purdue, I was around people who were doing research or talking about projects. And, my youngest is an academic, reading and interacting with lots of research, but you really, that academic research really is limited too, because you can't get money for it unless it's of interest to the person who's funding the research.
Right.
And then, those folks have to pay to have that research even published in the journals a lot of times. So there's a huge money issue involved. Like if you can't find anybody interested in proving, which we could argue has already been proven, the value of play, or how play is, what our programs should be doing the most of, then you're not going to have a lot of new research to defend that when you go into arguments like this about universal pre-K or different government funded kinds of initiatives.
I was thinking I was part of one research project, and I thought it was a good question too, right? So it was actually based on, my sister is also a preschool teacher. I don't think I've ever brought that up, but
nice.
In her classroom, she would do a thing where she would just call big paper and cover the table in paper and give kids things to mark with. And so she's in Head Start, where they have very specific goals around literacy. And so she would argue that this is how kids are going to learn literacy, because whatever they're doing around it, some kids are going to be writing, but some kids are just going to be talking while they're doing it and noticing what other kids are doing. Her wife is a researcher on literacy, so decided, well, let's just show, it was qualitative research, but it followed some kids from my classroom and her classroom. So I had sort of middle class, mostly white kids, and she had mostly BIPOC, low income kids. And let's see what happens. And sure enough, in both rooms, there's, following these, however many kids they ended up using the stories of, these like 5 kids from each environment, their literacy skills increased. And you can see it during this, and the question, it's one of those, I guess what I liked about it was the research was done around having to prove, like, it's okay to have kids sit around a table and draw and write. So it's something that people do, and probably for Head Start, you're wasting time because you should be doing flashcards. I don't know what the pressure would have been. So it's kind of nice to sort of turn it back on them, like, oh no, look, we have evidence now.
I want to play big paper. That sounds great.
But it is that question of, like, what do you do it for? And that was one that's a little different, because it did go to the university level, but it was definitely really based on a classroom first. So, I guess my sister could have been, my sister, I think, started as the researcher first, of like, oh, she's noticing, because she was thinking more about inclusion. These kids who have a harder time holding, say, a pencil or a marker or something, can they be around, how do you include them in this? And then what are the conversations they have? And found that, the kids were just as involved, engaged, even if the marks they made were different. And, so that's how she started as researching it, right? It was more about how she get her whole class involved. And, definitely some pressure from above that it had to be literacy. So she's like, well, this is the thing that gets children engaged.
I think give me 5 minutes, I can make anything literacy. I can form an argument for the favor of that. But no, I get that it really was what we traditionally think of as literacy practice. But it's that thing of but I do think it's the teacher researcher, and I think, of course, you'd agree too, right, that it's also the child as researcher, which happens all the time when they put things in their mouth and whatever. That's kind of what schema is, right? Absolutely. In a way. Yep. So what just occurred to me is, I wonder if I can recall now that what I was going to say. Doesn't seem like I'm going to be able to.
This is my cue to start talking about something.
So go ahead, Mike.
Well, I want to go back to the original thing too, to not lose track of. Partly, I feel like it is that states are creating or have created these quality rating systems based on evidence-based research and things. And again, it's like choosing what the research is, because I know brain research isn't the thing we talk about anymore, but the thing of like just having good relationships, interacting with other people socially, whether it's just meeting eye contact, whatever, increases brain activity, increases neuron growth, increases and neuron growth, not just neuron pathways. And the more neuron pathways are used, the more the thicker the myelination gets,
Right.
the more efficient they become.
I still talk about brain development. I don't.
Yeah. I bring it up because I know I just watched the last episode I recorded with you. And
Oh
so
yeah,
I'm so tired of brain
Carol.
research.
Yeah.
Yeah. And fair, but it's also interesting because that brain research actually shows that caring and love and relationships actually are the thing that builds neurons, but that wouldn't be considered. I don't think people talk about it as evidence-based. I mean, they might say it's research-based, but not evidence-based.
They would maybe just call it science.
Yeah. But I mean, you could say the evidence is the neuron pathways are, becoming more efficient. Or
but
more neuron growth.
Like so much early childhood research, it gets misused and misunderstood. Brain development is a good example of that. And I'll go back to, was it early 2000s when we first started talking about the first 3 years being the most important for a child's development, late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And so people took that and were like, oh, okay, the research says these are the most important years. Let's cram them full of academic training during the first 3 years.
Yeah.
Or I think about even now with the universal pre-K conversations, they say research shows that high quality early childhood education leads to all these results, like less likely to go to prison and more likely to graduate from high school and have a good job and whatever. And if we look, what they're talking about usually is the Perry Preschool project, the Ypsilanti, or is that the same thing?
That's the same one.
Yeah.
The Abacterian.
And Rebecca Marcon's study, which are pretty old now. But if you look at what their research did indicate that those good things would happen, but what was happening in the high quality early childhood program wasn't academic training.
Right.
It was a lot of play. There was some, academic instruction. There was a lot of family support.
I was going to say there's home visiting
and helping families address some of the stressors that would affect their children. So it's not just these studies show early childhood is best, so we're going to cram school down into the 3-year-old room. It was
it's really interesting the way people and even because the Perry School project, I don't know if you know, Louise Derman Sparks was one of the 4 teachers.
Have you read her article, her reflections on the
talked
Ypsilanti?
to her about it and seen her speak on it. And she's very much like, this was actually about home visiting. This was about relationships. And what they were trying to do was, I don't know what word to use, maybe honor the intelligence, the what the children brought, right? So it wasn't looking for academic results. It was, what are these children doing? The story I still remember, I can't remember if it's in the article, was about the kid who, because the housing projects right next to the school were a lot of kids, a lot of the kids lived there. And one kid decided that they were kind of bored at school, so they went home. And she and the other teachers really appreciated, wow, he could find his way home. Right? Like that was, they were, and granted it was 1962, 63. So, I don't think anybody really worried about it that much. I think the article is called something like the Ypsilanti Project Lessons I Learned or something like that. But it's Louise Derman Sparks. And I remember reading it a few years ago and thinking, this puts a lot of what we hold as canon on its head. Right.
In early childhood, her reflections of what it was supposed to be and how it's been presented.
And there's a pretty good NPR story about it as well. I don't know which of their programs it was, but they talked about the way originally it was trying to show that you could change IQ scores. And when they were looking at the information they had, the data, excuse me,
Yeah.
they realized, oh, like there isn't much change here, but there's huge change in terms of the social emotional learning. And they looked at that, and then it turns out that that actually has a much better correlation, if we want to use research terms, to what people do as adults. And even now, what the children who were in that study, like those results in terms of, like you said, prison, welfare, finding a job, the highest level of education, all those factors. And if we use those, then there aren't many studies, and there are only about a few hundred kids, like maybe 100 in each of the studies or something.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they clearly show that, oh yeah, social emotional learning is the most effective. If your evidence you're looking for, what will kids know more letters in kindergarten or whatever, it's like, yeah, research will show that, yep, just drilling kids on letters, just like drilling kids on the Yankees infield, will result in better retention of or knowledge of that little isolated fact.
Yeah. And just there, like I said, I enjoy reading research, thinking about it, talking about it. What I've learned is that I just don't take it, at its face, at its word or whatever. And so there are ways to look at it and critically process it. I like to look up the references that are cited, and but actually I think it's Head Start has a really good document about reading research and what the different terms mean and how to sort of process the information. That if I think about it, maybe I'll put it in the comments on when the episode goes. So again, I don't want people who are listening to think, oh, she's anti-research and she just called my whole job junk because I'm a researcher. I just think that it has to be more than just saying the word research-based or evidence-based.
Right.
And the goal, it's okay to question
and requiring that to be like, you only use that.
Yeah.
And for something like education, like, well, there's so much that hasn't been researched.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, lining up to go somewhere, how much research has been done about that? And I'd really like to see any research that shows that that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that be a great one to tell your administrator? Like, well, I can't have the kids line up because there's no evidence.
No evidence. So we can use it.
We
can use it in our favor sometimes. Then I don't have any evidence that says they need to sit crisscross apples.
Well, as a teacher researcher, I have plenty of evidence that it doesn't work. But but it's that funny thing that people really don't mean it when they say they want to require evidence-based teaching methods.
Yeah,
they have a very small, very narrow idea of what is it teaching. Like, you're not teaching most of the time because they think of, I mean, it really gets back to Carol's argument, right? They don't think of care as being education.
Right.
So it's only when you're in teacher mode you use evidence-based, and then everything else, do whatever you want or whatever. It just.
Yeah. If you think about a full day in a childcare center, and just think about the elements of the daily schedule, it's really just 9 to 11 anyway, of that full day that most children are in care, that we're focusing on academic training and talking about being research-based. And that leaves for a lot of kids 8 or 10 other hours,
right?
6 or 8 other hours, maybe more likely, but of the day where we're not worried about whether it's evidence-based or not. They're free play, they're in center time, they're napping, they're eat whatever. So it just needs to be broadened maybe too sometimes when we say our program is going to be evidence-based. Well, let's look at the evidence in care ethics research, or let's look at evidence from we have the play research. I just did my end of year countdown of my 5 best books that I read of the year, and Let the Children Play by Pasi Sahlberg and William Doyle was the second on the list. And the quote was something about, someday we will really look at this research we already have. And you could look at that play research in the same critical mode that we've been talking about with this other. But I think the difference is when I read play research, it's very child-centered. It's very much about what the child is experiencing and what kinds of practice they get with different skills. And when I read the academic training research, it's much more about what the adults are doing to get the kids to be something else.
So that gets back to who is it for, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think I like that question, and is that it always gets back to that. If you ask those three questions, then you kind of get stuck with, like with the play-based one. I mean, even if you did it in reverse of what would be the worst outcome if you let children play versus what would be the worst outcome if all you did was, I don't know, letter recognition, it just, it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, that's part of it, right? Is what is the harm that could be done?
Yeah.
Although, like you said, that I think a lot of times they are thinking, oh, we're only talking about 5 minutes a day. And it's like, so you're spending this much time for 5 minutes of an 8-hour or 10-hour day of a child? Like, what? There's a problem with what you're looking for, and what we should be doing is, what is the best situation, environment, whatever you want to say, for children, whether they're at a place where people are being paid to care for the child, or whether they're at home being cared for the child, or they're at a friend, family, neighbor, whatever, like they're at someone's house who's volunteering to do it, or grandma's there. That's what we'd want to know, right? Isn't it like what's best for children, not what's
that's sure the rhetoric we hear,
is
that this is about children,
right?
But that's not the action I see a lot of the times. And you can never really be sure too how much just maturation factors in to a research project of any topic, just how much would have happened already because the child's moving through her own developmental stages, or
right. And then the other, when you say that, it just made me think of the whatever, atypically developing, right? That the more, like if someone gets labeled special needs, then suddenly evidence-based is just sort of piled on.
Yeah.
And again, that's when we had the conversation with Emmy
and Amanda,
whatever episode number that is, not too long ago.
No.
They've talked about that, right? Of, well, all the children, just sort of have informal conversation at mealtime, but then the ABA therapist was insisting this one child had to like ask for things in a very specific way, and all that, and it was just that, like, so we're suddenly piling this onto one, and ABA does the same thing of calling itself evidence-based,
right? The only evidence-based response for ABA or for autism,
right? And it just it's that thing of what is the evidence you're looking for, and because there's plenty of evidence, maybe not scientific evidence, but like I think I've said before, I haven't met a single autistic adult who had to go through ABA therapy who thinks that it was worthwhile,
or good for them.
Good for them.
I'm
sure there's somebody maybe is, but there's plenty of evidence that it's not,
right? And
in general, I feel like, why don't we listen to adults? So when we get into special needs, why don't we listen to adults with the similar thing, the deaf community for what to do,
well, and there's
the classrooms of deaf and stuff. Sorry.
That just is another sort of aspect then of using evidence-based practices professionally, is that each profession has their own base of evidence. Right. So if I'm using my evidence-based approach to teach these 3 to 5 year olds, but then, their therapist comes in and has a different approach, we have to figure that out. And it's very tricky to do it just for yourself, but then you bring in somebody else to the team or to the classroom or the setting, and you have to start all over again, kind of.
Right. So I guess I think I like your idea of just saying it, like that idea of being now I'm spacing on a word,
excellent,
hesitant when you hear the word evidence-based, like, well, I mean, I don't want to say that I wouldn't do it in the classroom, but what is it? And
yeah,
how
it's just a matter of curiosity, like so many things
Curiosity,
in working
yeah.
with young children. It's hard for people who want answers and solutions to classroom problems, and who feel pressured by whatever the outside source is. It's hard for them, for some of them, to allow themselves to feel curious. And then we get out of the habit of being curious, or we go to school to get a degree and we're told that we now know how to be a professional early childhood educator, and our curiosity is sort of poo-pooed. But it's the same thing. You hear evidence-based, your first question should be, okay, why, or what, or who, all those things that you had, those three questions.
And I want to bring up one. So this is a story I heard. I don't know if it's actually true.
Okay.
But the evidence is here because I'm saying it, and now it'll be on the internet. So it must be true.
So it's going to be true.
But during No Child Left Behind, somebody, they were like interviewing, or, going to schools, kind of talking to people. And a teacher said, or no, I guess it was more about a business thing, but because they're asking like business leaders. So when the guy made, I forgot, like was in charge of a company that made like blueberry muffins, or, like a bakery.
Oh,
so, okay.
Yes.
So when you make, do you know this quote? Like, when you make blueberry muffins, what happens if you get a shipment of bad blueberries? Oh, well, of course we don't use those, or we send them back. And okay. So in education, whoever we get, we work with, and we're not just, we work with, and we don't just make muffins. Like, we're not making one thing. We're making future astronauts. We're making future painters. We're making future podcast hosts, like this wide variety of things.
But we still try to function like a factory.
Yeah, but we try to function like a factory. And it's like, there is no one thing that will work for every kid. And if that's what you're looking for, then you're in the wrong business.
Maybe a muffin factory is where you should be.
So
I'd forgotten about that story.
But I think it still illustrates that people keep thinking of it as, you're not just making, one thing. There's many things. So you're not even just making baked goods,
That's right. But and that sort of goes to what Peter Gray wrote about in terms of short-term goals being what a lot of the research was focused on. So we talk about school readiness in early childhood education. I would offer that we're really just talking about kindergarten screening readiness. Like, that's really all that is. So if we can say all of our 5-year-olds got into kindergarten, so this curriculum is effective, or that 3rd grade test that everybody has to take, and not look at what happens after those things are accomplished. It's just we have to ask more questions about it, and we have to figure out, okay, you say it's evidence-based. What is the evidence? What's the goal? And then those 3 questions.
Right. Yeah. And then if it is, they're just looking at kindergarten or even 1st grade scores alone, then it's like, well, then that research, or that is not the evidence I need.
Yeah. It's
not even teaching 1st graders or future 1st graders. I'm teaching humans. And then you have to get into care, and it gets messy. And in some ways, the anti-care bias is all part of this too.
Sure, because you can't measure care. And there's a quote that I'll botch, and I don't remember who said it, but it's, not everything that can be measured. You can't measure everything that should be measured, and some things that should be measured can't be, something like that.
And I always think of the story, I think you've used this too, right? Of the person looking under, a darkened parking lot, looking by the street light for their keys. Someone comes to help, and they're like, so you dropped your keys right over here. It's like, no, I dropped them over there, but this is where the light is. It's like, I only want to look at the things that are easy. Like, it's not helpful when you're talking about humans. So
all right. Well, I think that's a good stopping place with that story. That key, the parking garage.
Actually, I have one last story is, what are your nails? I have like glittery green.
Mine are, where's my hand? She's a Trooper, they're called, and they're like an olive green kind of
Okay.
color.
Yeah,
but
it's funny when you were moving
Color
your hand, I
Street.
was like, oh, I think we're close.
I know. I
on
was
color.
noticing yours
Yeah.
too, and I was like, I can't bring it up again. I bring this up every time Mike and I record. Still
Oh, I
holding
think
out
this
for
is
that
what the
Color Street
listeners
sponsorship.
Mine, I have to say, these ones are not Color Street,
The
but
listeners expect it now.
yeah, but you can see mine are chipping already.
Yeah.
Because I didn't use Color Street, you see? So.
Thank you. That'll get me the
Evidence-based.
endorsement
This
I've
is
been
the
waiting for. It's
evidence we needed.
evidence-based that Color Street is better. Although mine are chipping too, but I just did a sloppy job of putting them on. That was just user error.
Well, there goes the partnership.
Yeah.
The sponsorship, I mean.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you as always, Mike. This was really fun and interesting. And I will try to remember all the things I quoted so that I can, all the resources I quoted so I can put them in when the episode comes out. But otherwise, that's it for us today. And come back again for another episode of That Early Childhood Nerd. Bye, everybody.